You ever feel like you're just drowning in news headlines, trying to figure out what a big new policy really means? Beyond the sound bites, it's like, yeah, information overload is real.
Yeah.
You just want the shortcut sometimes, right? To actually understand it properly without reading like hundreds of pages. Well, if that sounds familiar, you are definitely in the right place today. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really significant recent government document. It's a presidential order called Protecting Women's Sports. And our mission today is pretty simple. Cut through the noise, get past the headlines, and just understand what this official document actually says. The policies, the directives, the reasoning inside the order itself. We want to lay out what it does, what it means for you.
Exactly. We're aiming for a totally impartial look here. The goal is just to distill what the order itself states, its core directives, its stated reasons. We're not taking sides, not endorsing anything. We just want to inform you, the listener, about what this document actually mandates and how it's supposed to impact different areas. Schools, sports bodies, even internationally, surprisingly.
And yeah, the source material couldn't be more official. It's an actual presidential order. So not a suggestion, not a memo. It's a formal directive from the top telling the federal government what to do.
Right. And what jumps out pretty quickly is just how broad this thing is. The title says Protecting Women's Sports, but the actions it orders touch on education funding, domestic sports groups, and like I said, even international relations. It's definitely more comprehensive than you might think at first glance.
Okay, so let's start where the order starts. Section 1, that's the policy and purpose bit. It kind of sets the stage, defines the problem it's trying to fix. It says pretty directly, in recent years, many educational institutions and athletic associations have allowed men to compete in women's sports. So according to the order itself, what's the problem with that? What's the core reasoning here?
Yeah, the order is very upfront about its reasoning. It claims that allowing men in women's sports, quote, is demeaning, unfair, and dangerous to women and girls, and denies women and girls the equal opportunity to participate and excel in competitive sports. That statement, right there in the document, is really the foundation for everything else that follows. It's the why behind the order. And what's interesting strategically is how it immediately tries to connect this to existing law, specifically Title IX, the 1972 Education Amendments Act. The order interprets Title IX to mean that schools getting federal money cannot deny women an equal opportunity to participate in sports. And to back up that interpretation, it actually cites a couple of federal court cases. It mentions Tennessee versus Cardona and Kansas versus U.S. Department of Education. These citations are used in the text to support the idea that, quote, ignoring fundamental biological truths between the two sexes deprives women and girls of meaningful access, and also to highlight what the order calls Congress's goals of protecting biological women in education. So it's building a specific legal argument right from the start.
Right. So based on that reasoning, what's the declared policy goal? What does it actually aim to do? It seems pretty clear. It says the policy is to rescind all funds from educational programs that deprive women and girls of fair athletic opportunities. And it adds that this situation leads to endangerment, humiliation, and silencing, and deprives them of privacy. And then it goes broader, saying the U.S. will oppose male competitive participation in women's sports more broadly, framing it as an issue of safety, fairness, dignity, and truth.
Exactly. And just one technical point to flag, Section 2 mentions that definitions from an earlier executive order, E04-14168 from January 2025, apply here. That earlier order is titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. Now, we don't have that document in front of us, so we can't dig into its specifics. But it's important for you listening to know that this order on sports operates using definitions set up by that previous one. So some key terms are likely defined there.
Okay, got it. So with that policy framework set up, where does the order focus its immediate action? Section 3 seems to zero in on schools, right? Preserving women's sports and education. What does that mean practically for schools and federal money?
Yeah, Section 3 gets very specific about what the Secretary of Education needs to do. First, comply with the vacatur of a particular rule from April 2024. Now, vacatur just means a court has nullified or set aside that rule, made it void. So the Secretary has to act as if that rule, which was about non-discrimination based on sex in federally funded education programs, is gone, again citing that Tennessee v. Cardona case. Then beyond that, the Secretary is told to take steps to affirmatively protect all female athletic opportunities in all female locker rooms. This means updating regulations and policies to, quote, clearly specify and clarify that women's sports are reserved for women. It links this back to what it calls Congress's demand for equal athletic opportunity for members of both sexes. And critically, it mandates prioritizing Title IX's enforcement against schools or athletic groups that, quote, deny female students an equal opportunity by requiring them in the women's category to compete with or against or to appear unclothed before males. So yeah, very direct instructions for the Department of Education.
That really lays it out for schools. And the money aspect, the federal funding seems like the main enforcement mechanism here.
Oh, absolutely. Section 3B makes that explicit. It says, all executive departments and agencies shall review grants to educational programs and, where appropriate, rescind funding to programs that fail to comply with the policy established in this order. So yeah, the link between following these rules and getting federal dollars is stated very clearly. And Section 3C adds that the Department of Justice needs to provide resources to make sure enforcement happens quickly. It's a pretty comprehensive approach within education.
Okay, so the financial pressure on schools is clear, but you mentioned this goes beyond education. Section 4, preserving fairness and safety in women's sports. Sounds like it widens the net. Where does it go next?
That's right. This is where it expands significantly. The order expresses concern about sports governing bodies. The organizations that run specific sports that either don't have an official stance on this or allow men and women's categories based on things like testosterone reduction or sincerely held gender identity. Yeah, the order explicitly calls those kinds of policies unfair to female athletes and do not protect female safety. So it's clearly signaling an intent to influence the rules across the board, not just in schools tied to federal funding.
That is a big step beyond schools. So who's tasked with pushing this broader policy out into the wider world of sports?
The order points to the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. They're given 60 days to do a couple of key things. First, convene meetings with major athletic organizations, governing bodies, and this is notable, female athletes harmed by such policies. The goal is to push for policies that fit the order's definition of fairness and safety. Second, they're supposed to convene state attorneys general. The idea is to identify best practices for protecting women's sports and, interestingly, to educate the AGs about, quote, stories of women and girls who have been harmed by male participation in women's sports. So it's using both high-level meetings and narrative sharing as strategies.
Wow, okay. And you mentioned an international angle too, which sounds pretty surprising for an order focused on domestic sports. How does it try to reach beyond the U.S.?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting and steps onto the global stage. The Secretary of State gets several directives here. First, they're told to basically rescind support for and participation in any international sports exchanges or programs where the women's category is based on identity and not sex.
Yeah.
So pulling U.S. involvement if the rules don't align. Second, the Secretary of State needs to promote, including at the UN, international rules that protect a sex-based female sports category. That's straight-up international diplomacy on sports rules. Third, working with Homeland Security, they have to review and potentially adjust policies about who gets admitted to the U.S., specifically targeting males seeking to participate in women's sports. The goal is to prevent such entry if the law allows, citing a part of the Immigration and Nationality Act. So an immigration angle tied to sports participation.
Immigration policy linked to sports participation. That's unexpected.
It is. And finally, there's a very direct instruction for the Secretary of State. Use all available means to push the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, to change its standards. The goal is to ensure eligibility for women's Olympic events is based on sex and not gender identity or testosterone reduction. That's aiming right at the top of global sports governance.
That is incredibly broad, from school funding to the UN to the Olympics and even immigration rules. Okay, before we wrap up, let's touch on Section 5 quickly. The general provisions. This is usually the legal boilerplate stuff, right? What's the gist of it?
Pretty much, yeah. These are standard clauses you see in most executive orders. They set the legal boundaries. Section 5A says the order doesn't override the authority of other agencies. Section 5B says it has to be carried out consistent with the law and, importantly, subject to the availability of appropriations, meaning it depends on Congress actually funding it. Then there's 5C, which is crucial. It states the order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit enforceable by private parties against the government. What that means for you, the listener, is that an individual can't just take this order to court and sue the government based only on this document to demand a personal right or benefit. It directs government action, but doesn't create new individual legal claims on its own. And 5B is just the standard severability clause. If a court strikes down one part, the rest is intended to stay in effect. So, yeah, standard legal framework stuff, but important for understanding how it works.
Wow. Okay. So let's just recap this deep dive. We've seen how this single presidential order on protecting women's sports aims to potentially pull federal funding from schools based on their policies, direct domestic sports bodies, and even engage in international diplomacy with the UN and the IOC, plus touch on immigration. Our goal today, just to be clear, was simply to walk you through what the official document itself says, the actions it orders, and the reasons it gives.
Right, and if you step back, you can really see how a single, clearly stated policy objective in an order like this is designed to ripple outwards.
Right.
To potentially influence a whole host of institutions, rules, even international relations. It really shows the potential reach of such directives, which raises a pretty interesting question, I think.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. So here's something to chew on. What stands out most to YUU about the sheer range of areas from your local schools, maybe, all the way to global Olympic rules that this one presidential order tries to shape? We hope this deep dive helped clarify what's actually in the document. We encourage you to keep digging into the topics that matter to you. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.